Everybody to today's event. My name is Matt Zwolinski. I am the director of the Center for Ethics, Economics, and Public Policy, which is one of the organizations that's sponsoring this event. We're also joined by the USD Center for Educational Excellence and their Just Read program and the Urgent Challenges Collective. This event is part of a series of events that we're running this year on focusing on issues of housing and homelessness. A couple of weeks ago, we had Connor Doherty here, who is the author of our Just Read book, Golden Gates. And you can find a video of that event online in case you missed it. And we've got another event in the coming weeks with one of the members of our local planning commission here in San Diego, who can talk about how some of these housing issues are playing out in the local context. Today, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Sandy Ikeda, who is a professor of economics at Purchase College of the State University of New York and a research associate at New York University. Ikeda is on the board of directors of the Center for Living City, and he is a globally renowned lecturer on issues involving urbanism. He has written on the economics of interventionism, on social capital, on market process, and his current research is focusing on the interconnections among cities, social cooperation, and entrepreneurial development. He's writing a book on the economics and social theory of Jane Jacobs, who I think will come up a little bit in our discussion today. I'm really excited to have him here today to talk about how economics can help us to untangle what he calls the housing paradox. So a few words here before we get going. We'll have a presentation by Professor Ikeda, followed by Q&A. If you've got questions that you would like to ask of Professor Ikeda, go ahead and submit those at any time using the Q&A function, which you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll read through those questions as the talk proceeds and as the Q&A session goes along, and then I'll try to ask as many of those as I can to him, depending on how we're doing on time. And I did also want to note that we'll be recording this event. It'll be posted on the YouTube channel of the Center for Ethics and Economics and Public Policy. So if you have to leave early, or if you have friends or family who weren't able to be here today, you'll be able to find the video there, along with videos of all our past events, including the Connor Doherty talk from a few weeks ago. So without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to turn things over to Professor Ikeda.
Well, thanks very much, Matt, and it's a pleasure to be here virtually. I love San Diego. It's a beautiful city, as most of you know. But I'm stuck here in Brooklyn, which actually, to tell you the truth, is not such a bad place to be stuck in. Yes, I would like to talk about affordable housing, and I know that the general theme of these talks and events has to do with homelessness, which is obviously a very serious phenomenon. And clearly, housing affordability is a big part of that phenomenon, part of the solution, making housing more affordable. And I should say at the outset that, like all social phenomena, it's extremely complex. And what I'm going to be doing today is using some basic economics to try to organize some thoughts, to try to clarify some issues. But in no way am I saying that what I'm going to do today is going to solve all the problems. It's at best going to identify some problems and point to some directions. No one has all the answers, although a lot of people have pieces of the answer. And I think economics and economic analysis is a big piece of that. So I'm going to, I have a PowerPoint presentation, and let me bring that up now. And the title of my talk is Using Economics to Untangle the Housing Paradox. So again, I'm going to use basic economics, and hopefully it'll clarify and organize our thinking, and it'll identify initially some paradoxical things. So what do I mean by paradox? Well, here are some. paradoxes. Now, a paradox is an apparent contradiction. In other words, it's not a real contradiction, but it looks like a contradiction. So one I have here is why is the price of housing rising so quickly in Paris, New York City, and London, but less so in central Tokyo, the most populated, one of the most popular areas of Tokyo? Why is that happening? It seems like a contradiction. It's not a contradiction if you look at it more closely. Next, if profit-seeking companies can make new cars for low-income families, why don't they build new houses for low-income families? In other words, if it's profitable to build a Ford Fiesta for people on low incomes, why couldn't you build a starter home for low-income families? And in fact, if you look around the world, and if you look at the history of the United States housing construction, you'll find that there were times that, in particular places, and Levittown comes to mind, where this was possible. Why can't we do that today? Or is it happening today and we're just not seeing it for various reasons? Also, housing policies intended to help low-income families can make things worse for them. So housing policies don't have to make things worse for low-income families, but they can, and they have, in ways that I want to identify today. Now, there are some real contradictions, and I think there's one that I think a lot of people, particularly Americans, hold. One thought is a home should appreciate in value, but at the same time also be affordable for all. So if you think about that a minute, right, we hear that investing in a home is a solid investment. The prices will rise over time. And so by the time you retire, you've got a nice nest egg and you can live comfortably. But at the same time, you want housing to be affordable. There's complaints about not only homelessness, but people in low incomes, even middle incomes. And as you well know, in San Diego, and if you're from up north in San Francisco, San Jose, that this is a big problem for people middle and upper middle income. So how is that possible if house prices are rising? So you can't want house prices to rise and also be affordable at the same time. I think that is a contradiction. Okay, let's look at some data first before I launch off into a more analysis. There's something called the median multiplier. The median multiplier, a lot of housing economists use. We take the median house price in an area, could be Tokyo, Yokohama, or could be New York, greater New York area, which includes parts of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Take the median house price and divide it by the gross household income, the median gross household income. So you're dividing a median by a median. This is called a median multiplier. And the house price is some factor times the median household income, gross household income. In Tokyo, Yokohama, and this data comes from Demographia, I should say that depending on your source, you may get different values for this, the different methodologies, and there's no standard methodology. But the one that comes from Demographia, which is one that I rely on quite a bit, Tokyo, Yokohama has a median multiplier of 4.7. So in other words, the median household income is 4.7 times greater than, the median household price, house price is 4.7 times greater than the median gross household income. Whereas in New York, it's 5.7, so it's greater in New York than in Tokyo, Yokohama. It's by this measure, less affordable in New York than in Tokyo, Yokohama, which I think some people would find surprising because one thinks of Tokyo as a city where things are very expensive, and they are, and in particular housing you would think be very expensive. But compared to New York City, it isn't. And compared to other cities in United States, San Francisco, Honolulu, it certainly is not. Look at some other data here. Why is it that we see this difference? Oh, by the way, when you go the median multiplier, the norms for the median multiplier are such that if the the multiplier is 3 or less, it's considered a reasonably affordable place to live. If it's greater than 3, then it becomes unaffordable. A place like Hong Kong has a median multiplier of about 20, so which is the highest in the world. So the median house price is over 20 times greater than the median household income. So it's far greater than any other city in the world, even Singapore, even London. So anyway, if it's greater than 3, then it becomes more of a problem. And in Tokyo and in New York and other places around the world, it is a problem. So if you look at Tokyo, London, Paris, and New York City in this histogram, the blue histograms are housing stock, or the histograms on the right, excuse me, on the left are housing stock growth between different years. In Tokyo, between 1998, housing stock grew by something just below 2%. At the same time, population, which is the histogram on the right, grew by about half of that. So in other words, the housing stock grew about twice the rate as the population did in Tokyo. Also in New York City, from 2000 to 2010, it grew. The population grew more slowly overall, but the housing stock grew twice as fast as the population did. On the other hand, in London and in Paris, you have that flips. Population has grown faster than housing stock in London and in Paris over a comparable number of years. Another index is a change in house price and population. And this comes from the Financial Times publication. I think it was published in 2016. This measures the change in house price and population from 1995 to 2015, a 20-year period. And this is very revealing. So London on the left now, and the histogram paired with that on the left, the pinkish, darker pinkish histogram, is house price, how high house prices rose during that 20-year period. And in London, house prices grew by over 400%, okay, by over a factor of 5, whereas the population grew much more slowly. Also in San Francisco, house prices grew by over a factor of 3, with a fairly modest, comparably modest growth in population. If you compare it to Tokyo, which is the one on the just left of center, house prices hardly grew at all. Well, compared to London and San Francisco. And if you look very closely, you'll see that population actually grew faster in Tokyo than the house prices did. Minato-ku is a ward in Tokyo, which is one of the most popular and fastest growing areas in Tokyo. And in Minato, you can see that the population has grown faster than Tokyo as a whole, but also that the house prices have grown rather modest, something like 40%. And the Financial Times article from which this is drawn has the following quotes: startling fact. In 2014, there were 142,417 housing starts in the city of Tokyo, more than the 83,657 housing permits issued in the state of California, which has a population 3 times as large, or the 137,010 houses started in the entire country of England, which has a population 5 times greater than that of Tokyo. So Tokyo had more housing starts in the year 2014 than these much larger populated areas, California and England. So that certainly explains a lot of the increased house prices we saw before and the median multiplier phenomenon. It continues. Whereas the price of a home in San Francisco and London has increased 231% and 441% respectively. I mentioned this before. Minato Ward, right, that popular area of Tokyo, has absorbed its population boom with price rises of just 45%. From another publication, Curbed, this is Patrick Sisson, about construction practices and house prices in the United States. Part of the reason for this slow growth in housing construction has to do with, and I quote, existing planning regulations, okay? And they often limit builders to say 4 units by a 50 by 100 foot lot. There are also fees, both in the form of impact fees and parking requirements, which conspire to keep architects and builders from using space in the most efficient manner. That is to say, in the manner that buyers want, especially if the goal is providing more, smaller, and cheaper housing. So what I like to tell my students in my economics classes is that any science, you're talking about physics or biology, chemistry, and economics, what you propose should be possible, right? You might say, for example, oh, everybody would be better off if gravity on Earth were half of what it is now. We'd all weigh less than, we'd all weigh half of what we do now. But unfortunately, that's not possible. It's not physically possible. Economic science tells us what's possible as well, or at least tells us what the constraints are, what the parameters are on what we want. And my friend and colleague, Steve Horowitz, give a shout out to Steve, puts it very succinctly. He says, ought implies can. What you propose must be possible. So sometimes what is possible conflicts with what you desire. And this little arrow, green arrow, has this quote, and this comes from a Facebook friend. So I didn't make this up, but it was a nice example from my Facebook page for a couple of days ago. He said, let's give the homeless homes, wash them up, give them psychological counseling, follow up with visits, and do it at low cost, right? So you can do these things, sure. But what we learn in economics is that, well, when there's scarcity, when resources, time, and other things of value are scarce, there's a trade-off. You do more of one thing, helping the homeless, you might have to do less of other, like less healthcare, less education, other things that we want. So, what economics tells us is that we make these decisions in markets, a lot of times, and the markets tell us what the price of something is, and it gives us some indication of what it's going to cost us to do different things. Okay, so ought implies can. And I'll bring this up repeatedly in my talk today. Okay, so now to the drawing board. I have a whiteboard behind me, and I've already got a diagram put up there. And this wouldn't be an economics talk without a diagram. No equations, but some simple diagrams. And what I want to do in this diagram, and I'll stop sharing my screen in a moment so I can use this the whiteboard behind me, is to talk about just basics of supply and demand, and then talk about rent regulation using that apparatus. So let me stop sharing so you can see. Hopefully, Matt, can you see me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, very good. And the board is okay?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, very good. So what I have up here is a simple model of a competitive market. This is the demand curve, and this is the supply curve. And this is the market for housing. I have housing written down here, and this is the price of housing measured on this axis. And what we learn in economics is that there's a tendency in a competitive market, as long as there's free entry and exit, and buyers are able to compete with each other and sellers are able to compete with each other freely, that you'll tend towards an equilibrium where at a given price, buyers are able to buy all that they want to of this particular good, and sellers are able to sell all that they want to of this particular good. So their plans mesh, and there's no disappointment. And in this model, I've said, well, let's say that price is $100,000 for a typical home. And altogether, that means in a given region, there'll be 50,000 homes built. That's a lot of homes, but let's say 50,000, 50K. That's the equilibrium. You'll notice that I've drawn the supply curve rather steep here. I've drawn it more steeply than the demand curve. SO is the supply curve. And that's to reflect what we call an inelasticity or insensitivity in the quantity supply to changes in price. Why did I draw it that way? Well, a lot of it has to do with regulations. Some of it has to do with simple land availability. If you live in an island, a small island, or you live in a canyon with steep walls, so you'll have this sort of phenomena as well. But in most places that don't have these tight geographic constraints, the steepness of the supply curve is at least heavily influenced by the regulations that constrain construction. Now, some of those regulations may be perfectly agreeable to most people, but still, if, for example, I wanted to rent out a room in my apartment here in New York City, I would be breaking the law. There may be somebody who's homeless and would be willing to pay, I don't know, $200 for a room and, you know, a key, $200 a week. I'm not, well, we have Airbnb in New York, but it's been practically regulated out of existence. But if I just saw somebody homeless on the street and I hadn't registered with you know, the state through some sort of organized sharing apparatus, I couldn't do it. Or if during a particular need for housing, and I have an attic or a basement, I couldn't simply convert it into a livable space. I'd be breaking the law. Just want to convert my notes here. Okay, so if in fact things were a little more flexible, the supply curve would be a little bit flatter. So let me show you, bring this up a little bit, what happens if there's an increase in demand. Little arrow there. So let's say the demand curve shifts to the right. That means more, let's say more buyers, more people want to settle in California. They move to California. I know that's not happening right now, but in the past, certainly, right? Increased demand for housing in California. This is happening like in Vancouver and elsewhere at the moment. I think Salt Lake City is another place that's experiencing an increase in demand. Many of those people coming from California. Anyway, so the price of a house would go up. Let's say that's $160,000. Okay, so that's a fairly, I've drawn it as a fairly significant increase in price. And the quantity will go up, but by a little. If it were possible in the short term to convert dwellings or office spaces or industrial spaces quickly into places to live, the supply curve would be flatter. Call it S0 prime. Okay, so that's the alternative reality. And in which case the equilibrium would be here and the price would be lower. Let's say that's 140,000. So just from some regulatory flexibility, you would see some reduction in price. Price wouldn't be as high in the circumstance as it would be. But what I want to talk about more is what prevents or what discourages people from investing and building new homes. That is, increasing the supply of housing over time, so that if it's a competitive market in the long run, this supply curve, call it SLR. Some months pass, 6 months, 8 months, 12 months. The number of homes, the number of units in this area could increase, and certainly over a period of years, so that eventually the price may fall back down close to $100,000. Now, that's not saying that things won't change in the meantime. If demand keeps creeping up, right, then if the demand increases more than supply increases, then the price is going to rise. But if supply increases more than demand, the price will actually fall below the original price. But in any case, let's say it could go as high as 100,000 units being produced, which is a lot of units. Okay, so what I'm referring to in this talk are to some extent the constraints that cause the short run supply curve, the original supply curve, to be steeper than usual, than it could be. But more importantly, what causes, what keeps entry, competition, builders from increasing the supply over time. Okay, that's basic number one. Let me actually draw another diagram. And I promise this is the last one. And this has to do with rent control. And those of you who take in economics will have studied this, so bear with me. And once again, housing, we're measuring housing. And then this is the price of housing, or let's say rent. Okay. And again, this demand for rental units. And I'll just draw the supply curve, essentially the same slope, just for simplicity, as the demand curve. Okay. Let's say at a market equilibrium, start off with a price of $1,000 a month. And as a result of that, you will have, say, 5,000 rental units being rented out per month. Somebody says, well, that's kind of high, $1,000, you know, low-income families can't afford that. Well, what can low-income families afford? Let's say $600. Let's cap the rent at $600. What basic economics tells you is, well, if you look at what the quantity that renters want to rent at that price, let's say it's it looks like 7,000, versus the quantity that suppliers of residential units, rental units want to supply, something like 4,000, you can have a problem, because the quantity that people want at that price of 600 is far greater than the quantity that they're actually going to be able to bid for. And we call this, as you know, a shortage. And in particular, the shortage will be, in this example, 7,000 units that are desired or quantity demanded, and only 4,000 quantity supplied. So you have a shortage of 3,000 units. Now, in a flexible market where prices are allowed to adjust up and down, this wouldn't last, right? Because buyers would compete against each other. They would bid up the price, or they would bid up the rental payments that they're willing and able to pay. Suppliers would respond to that by moving up the supply curve, by supplying more. But if this is a hard cap, if this is a price ceiling that is strictly enforced, this shortage will be a chronic shortage. You have a chronic shortage, and you're not solving the problem. In fact, you're making it worse, at least for a lot of low-income people. Only 4,000 units are being provided on the market. You have 7,000 who are bidding for it. Obviously, not all of them are going to get it. So those who happen to be able to rent at $600 a month maybe feel pretty happy, right? Because, oh, otherwise we'd be paying $1,000. We're saving $400 a month. That's great. But there are all these other people, 3,000 people or so, that aren't able to rent. Okay, they're homeless in the simple model. They have to find some kind of accommodation, but not in the normal conventional housing market. So you have this chronic shortage of 3,000 units. And other things happen, and sort of the first order effects is that the people who are looking for apartments at $600 can't find it, so they're going to spend more time, more energy than normally they would. And time and energy, it has value, right? We can measure it to some extent in dollars. Not only that, they're willing to make side payments to the owners and landlords of rental buildings, in the form of like, furnished apartments that have maybe, a table and a chair in it. They might be willing to pay multiple months rent deposit. They may be able to do other things that give a landlord a benefit that's sort of under the table, as it were, right? They pay $600 a month in rent, but there's other costs that have to be on top of that, which the renters themselves would have to pay. So the renters' costs would rise. Well, how much would they rise? In this simple model, if there are 4,000 units, then on the demand side, buyers would be able and willing to pay up to whatever the demand curve, says. That's what the demand curve does, right? It expresses what the maximum price buyers are willing and able to pay, what they're able and willing to pay for a unit out of these 4,000. We'll go over here. Let's say that this is looks like, I don't know, 1,300. So the full price that they pay would be the $600 plus the additional, let's say in this case, $700 equivalent of rent. So the real costs go up. And that's the people who are renting. There are these other people who aren't getting any housing at all. So you have homelessness and a chronic housing shortage. Okay, let me go back to share screen. So you have these effects: chronic shortages, higher costs, also lower maintenance. I should have mentioned that. Landlords who aren't able to cover their rental payments. After all, time looking for an apartment that's borne by the searchers is not something that can be paid to the landlord, right? Dollars can't, you can transmit for that to the landlord, but you're wasting time. Nobody gets that, right? You expend it, but nobody gets it. In economics, we call that a deadweight loss. It's just pure waste. So those landlords who don't get the higher rent will skimp on other margins. They won't clean up the hallways. They won't replace stuff when it breaks down. They won't be nice to you. In fact, they'll try to get you out of the apartment as quickly as they can, because most rent regulation allows landlords to raise rent just by some percentage. I think under the new California law, it's something like 5% under certain circumstances. And so the faster they can chase renters out, the more rapidly they can raise the rent. And even a kind person might be tempted to do things that, or certainly refrain from doing things that would encourage people to stay. Ordinarily, a landlord would want you to stay. They want stability. But what rent control tends to do is do the opposite. Landlords want to get you out. Second order effects of rent regulation is that it gives you greater scope for, you as a landlord, greater scope for discrimination. In other words, if there's a free market, there's prices are free to adjust. And let's say that a rent is $1,000, okay, under those circumstances. If there's somebody you don't like, okay, who's willing to pay $1,000, but you just don't like them, well, you have to forsake that $1,000 and wait till somebody else is going to rent the apartment. It may be some time. I've personally had this experience. My wife and I've had this experience where there's some discrimination. And there was a delay in us being able to get an apartment. So there's that. But with rent regulation, with rent control, like that's effective in this way that causes a chronic shortage, there are a lot of people waiting for that apartment. Okay, so it's not like, well, if I don't rent to you for $1,000, I'll rent it next day or next week or something. So there's some cost to it. But if there's a whole lot of people there, you think, I like you, I don't like you, I don't like you, I like you. How much do I like you more than? So you can sort of, your prejudices can be expressed more. There are fewer constraints on manifesting your prejudices, right? So rent ceilings lowers the cost of that kind of discrimination. Right? When people are eager to rent from you, even if they are being discriminated against, and you as a landlord can choose who you want. It's greater choice. There's a pool of people that you can choose, and your personal preferences. And it doesn't have to be race. It often is race or lifestyle, but it could be other things. Somebody who's a musician, somebody, artist or something like that. You greater scope for that kind of thing. But again, there's scope for all kinds of discrimination, many of which I think most of us would find repugnant. The other thing that can happen over a longer period of time is if you can't rent your apartment, you might convert your apartment to a condominium, right? Where there's less regulation on the price, right? And so you can recoup your investment by selling the unit rather than renting it out and be subject to the laws. Phase 3, or a third order effect, this is something that the Nobel Prize winning economist Friedrich Hayek identified many years ago in his book, The Constitution of Liberty. And this quote is from that book. He says, because of rent restriction, large sections of the population in Western countries have become, in their daily affairs, subject to arbitrary decisions of authority and accustomed to looking for permission and direction in the main decisions of their lives. Okay, so your housing is such an important part of your daily life. And if that's sort of controlled by the law, you would expect more reliance of people on regulatory authorities, on housing, on other things as well. So it's going to have this psychological, maybe ideological impact on people who are subject to rent control. Okay, again, ought implies can. What is possible has to be consistent with your good intentions, right? You want low-income families and households to be able to have decent housing at reasonable, affordable cost, which is, I think, a wonderful intention. But the methods that you use to achieve that should be consistent with economic reality. And I think most economists on the left and the right would agree, not everybody, right? But most economists on the left and the right would agree that rent control is a pretty poor way of achieving that particular objective. Another way of achieving that objective is to provide public housing or social housing, where the government becomes the landlord. And how this works basically is if you earn below a certain income, there are other factors as well, but if you're earning below a certain income, then you qualify. If you earn more than that for a certain period of time, then you can't stay. So people who live in public housing are all sort of homogeneous in terms, more or less heterogeneous in terms of the income, and less diversity in their background. And these projects tend to be isolated, they're dull and dangerous places. And there's a stigma attached to housing in council housing, social housing, public housing, whatever you call it, right? That can be attached to that. It's sort of like, second-class citizens in a way. Other consequences is I've never had to look for public housing, but what happens is, you apply and then housing becomes available and you go there and, there's an apartment and you take it or leave it. you may have more than one choice, but from what I understand, you reach the top of the queue, you reach the front of the queue. So this house becomes available. It's a 2-bedroom unit that you've applied for. It happens to be in a particular location. So you go there and it's yours. But if you don't like it, then you go back to the bottom. So you largely take what you're assigned. Now, it may be different in different places, but something like this happens. There's a queue. But once you get into a public housing space, because there's a means test, you're pretty limited in where you can work. Your job prospects are limited to a commuting distance of, the norm from what I understand in planning is about an hour, right? Hour or two and coming back. Some people commute longer, some shorter, but anything much farther than an hour, you might have to move. So part of the labor market in cities is mobility of where you can live, not only just mobility in terms of cars or trains and buses. If you can't switch your dwelling very easily because you have public housing that you would lose, or you apply for public housing in another part of the city that might be closer to this job that you're offered, it could take months and months for you to find out whether you're going to get that unit. So you're pretty much stuck in this particular housing project that you're living in, which really constrains your mobility and therefore your earning capacity. There's a lack of safety, as we know, in public housing. It's a haven for gangs. All right, next, let me talk about zoning very quickly, or talk about the history of zoning. There's always been zoning of some kind, that is regulations about how you can use space, going back to ancient Rome. Probably if you go back to ancient Greece, or probably ordinances that say you can't slaughter a goat in somebody's backyard or something like that. I mean, I don't know. So we refer to these things as good neighbor regulations that economists would put it as you want to limit negative externalities. So you separate noxious or toxic emissions, slaughterhouses, butcheries, tanneries, things like that. And you tell people you can do this outside the city limits, but not where people are living and doing business. Also, providing infrastructure like streets and water and sewer and things like that. These are a kind of basic urban planning and zoning. But then there's always been exclusionary zoning. In medieval times, the medieval town would have a wall, and only certain people were allowed within the wall, and could only live in certain places. Anybody else has to live outside the wall, in the suburbs, so to speak. More recently, in the late 19th, 20th century, we have exclusionary zoning and covenants, which are explicitly aimed at undesirable groups, or trades that are associated with those groups, like Chinese laundries in San Francisco, or bars and such in other cities. Blacks and the Irish in New York City were discriminated against in just this way. And then later in the mid 20th century, that kind of explicit exclusionary zoning became illegal. So what we have today are different kinds of zoning. The most common kind of zoning we talk about is functional zoning, or sometimes it's called Euclidean zoning, where you separate uses. And the basic uses are things like commercial uses, industrial uses, and residential uses. In the United States, we're unusual. Sonia Hurt, who is an urban historian, has done really good work. She has a book called Zoned in the USA that came out a few years ago. And she argues that the United States is exceptional in its zoning for detached single-family dwellings. You don't find that as rigid kind of zoning like that in Europe and other countries. But basically, functional zoning, forbids certain kinds of mixed uses. I said residential, commercial, industrial. And all countries have them to one degree or another. In Japan, however, remember Japan's price increases were slower than everyone else, and the median multiplier was lower than New York City. Japan's zoning is extremely simple compared to, say, New York. I had a student who did a senior project, part of which was to count all the zoning regulations pertaining to a particular part of the city. And it was really impossible to do. We're talking about 600 or so different regulations pertaining to one area, because there's so many variances that are allowed within that area. And so if you want to start a business identical to somebody, maybe even in the same area, you may not be able to, because that guy got a variance, and so you would have to apply for a variance, which would take a very long time to get. And so it's extremely complicated in that way. In Japan, the zoning ordinances are set nationally, so local interest groups can't ever have a harder time blocking uses. Secondly, in Japan, instead of having hundreds of zoning codes, there are only 12. And if you Google zoning in Japan, there's some nice graphics. I don't have one here, showing you exactly what kind of uses are permitted. The basic idea is if you want to live and build a home in a commercial or an industrial area, more or less you're allowed to do that. In a factory area or an office area, you can do that. However, you can't, it's hard to go the other way. You can't build a factory in a residential area. So what this does is it controls, for the most part, for externalities, these sort of good neighbor type of externalities, by allowing people to choose where they want to live. And the other thing that happens when you have this mixed use is the Jane Jacobs effect, which we'll talk about later. One of the things she complained about in her very famous book of 1961 called The Death and Life of Great American Cities is that functional zoning tends to make cities, streets, and other public spaces dead zones at different times of day and different days of the week, right? If it's exclusively residential, then everybody's at work between 9 to 5, and so there's not much going on, right? Not much street life. And after they come home, there's not much street life. In an area that's zoned for commercial office space, after 5 o'clock, it's dead. Okay, 5 p.m. and until people go to work the next day. But if you were to mix these things together, you have people on the street all the time, and that generates a kind of emergent safety and monitoring by people. And so the functional zoning, strictly enforced as it is a lot more, as I said, in the United States than elsewhere, some cities more than others, prevents this blending of uses and the sort of lively interaction that results from that. All right, so there are different things that zoning covers. Maximum density, or you can't have heights higher than a certain amount. Minimum floor area ratio, FAR. Minimum setback from the streets, maximum heights, minimum lot sizes, right? You can't have a lot size smaller than 100 by 50 feet or something like that. Zoned simply for single family units, right? I mentioned US as sort of sui generis in this respect. Minimum parking requirements, right? 1.5 parking units, parking spaces per unit, right? That takes up space. All of these things that I'm listing here tends to reduce the supply of dwellings, supply of housing. All right, so let's assume that these policies are well-intentioned and well-informed by middle-class sensibilities, right? You don't want houses to be cramped, right? So let's set the minimum square footage at 350, 400 square feet. We want people to be able to walk on the sidewalks without encumbrance, so you have setbacks. We think parking should be available in any civilized society, so let's require parking, even if developers might not want that because maybe their customers don't want it initially. And let's zone for single-family homes because that is, after all, the American dream, to have a home that you can invest in and appreciate over time. And it it will appreciate over time when you constrain the supply in this way. Okay, so they all have these consequences of restricting the supply of housing, of driving up the price of housing, and of making housing less affordable, especially to lower income households and underrepresented minorities. I think your speaker last time talked about this as well. Okay, I just mentioned there are other kinds of zoning. There's form-based zoning, which restricts the size of buildings, materials used, and style. There's performance zoning, which is supposed to focus on environmental or sustainability objectives. Okay, I looked at these. I won't talk about it too much here. These can be less disruptive than functional zoning, but a lot of times, form-based zoning and performance zoning sort of becomes functional zoning, that they tell you what you can and can't do on your property. And so it's in terms of use, right? Some uses tend to have to have certain forms, warehouses, businesses, offices. And so if that's the case, then they're excluded. So de facto, form-based zoning and even performance zoning can be exclusionary, or can be functional and separating uses in this way. Lastly, with respect to zoning, there's something called inclusionary zoning, where builders, let's say if they're building an apartment building, have to set aside 10 or 20% of their units for below market. And this is a form of localized rent control. And all I'll say about that is it has the same effect as the broader citywide rent control. That is to say, it creates shortages, drives up the costs of the investors, and by raising the cost and lowering the returns on the development, it's going to reduce the supply of housing. Now, you may think that's worthwhile, but that's a consequence. And again, there'll be a long list of people who are going to who will apply for the below market housing. And certainly most of them will be disappointed. So it's only the privileged few that will get the below market housing. All right, so let's talk briefly about solutions. I'll end with these solutions. Let's say we retain the regulations to contain negative externalities, these good neighbor policies, noxious and toxic emissions. But let's remove subsidies for things like urban development. So for example, highways and infrastructure that extend private development out into the exurbs and suburbs. So sometimes this is called suburban sprawl. Make developers pay for their share of the connection costs to the local roads, these connections, sewers, electricity, water. So, within the developments, they're responsible, but the connections, often that's paid for by the general public. And, that's a big subsidy. In general, liberalize land use and increase the supply of housing. So eliminate zoning for detached single-family homes. The state of Minnesota recently outlawed zoning for single-family detached homes. That doesn't mean you can't build them, right? It just means that you can't exclude somebody who doesn't want to, who may want to build a duplex or a triplex or something. You can't exclude them now. But the way my colleague Nolan Gray, again, a shout out to Nolan Gray, if you read his work, it's very, very good. He puts it in a very nice way. He says that multifamily housing, 10 units and above, is a way for poor people can compete with the rich for real estate. In other words, if you're a developer, one way to make good profits is to build a lot of units on a given plot of land. Now, the higher you build, each floor gets more expensive to build, but there's some trade-off there. But you can find some height of building, as long as there's not a restriction on the height, that will more than pay for itself. And that way, people with lower family and lower household incomes can afford to live on that plot of land, maybe in the center of the city or in a desirable location. Whereas, if you were zoned as a single family dwelling, only a very, very rich person could live there, right? So multifamily housing is one way that the poor can outbid the rich for land. Allow auxiliary dwelling units, right? You can double the number of units in a lot of places in California and elsewhere by allowing granny flats to be built. Also within blocks that have narrow empty lots or undeveloped lots, there are these what are called stick plexes, narrow, cheaply built homes, right? These are the kind of startup homes, but they're new. These are the Ford Fiestas of the real estate market. So allow those to be built. Minimum parking requirements, minimum FAR, minimum setbacks, lot size, these need to be liberalized. Either, I think minimum parking can be just jettisoned altogether. So when you jettison minimum parking requirements, that doesn't mean there's going to be no parking. What it means is that the developers and investors will build parking to what they expect will be the demand, right? Just like anything else. Emily Hamilton and I published a study for Mercatus, and I mentioned it at the end of my talk, which was a literature review of economist studies of what affects housing prices. And one part of that had to do with studying minimum parking requirements. And most of the time, in areas where there are minimum parking requirements, developers will only build to the minimum and no more, right? They don't build more than 1.5 or whatever the minimum is. And the reason for that is because there's no demand for it, which suggests that if there were no requirements, they would build fewer parking spaces because nobody wants that many, or they're not in that greater demand. So get rid of that, get rid of a maximum height for the most part. It doesn't mean not altogether, but liberalize them. Legalize single room occupancy, flop houses, long stay motels. Paul Groth has a book called Living Downtown, which talks about how, if you're poor, back in the early 20th century, otherwise homeless, well, an SRO would give you a place to store your stuff, have a lock and key. Okay, they weren't pleasant places to live, but at least, you're not on the street where you always have to carry everything you have with you all the time, otherwise it's going to be lost. So if that's the case, you're never going to be able to work, or you can't take your, your shopping cart with you when you work at, when you go to work. So this is a place where you could, store your belongings, your valuables, lock it, and you have a place to go, and you have an address. You have an address that you can put on your job application, and it'll certainly help your employment. Well, we've basically regulated those things out of existence. So they really don't exist so much in New York anymore. Long stay motels do exist in other parts of the country outside big cities, as do trailer parks. Right? Trailer parks, again, may not be, I've had family members who live in trailer parks, some are better than others, but it's a way to have a roof over your head, some privacy, and some security. And those are being regulated heavily. More active, you want demand side? Well, how about vouchers for renters? Instead of building public housing, instead of rent control, most economists will say, well, giving people vouchers to rent anywhere they want to would be a better solution. Although this may have the effect of increasing the price of apartments. On the supply side, Jay and Jacobs had an interesting proposal, which was to subsidize builders as long as they would have as tenants people from the local area. So you're not displacing people in the community. Her idea was to preserve community. Whether that's workable or not, is debatable, but it's an alternative solution. It's thinking outside the box. And there's some actual policies that are like this. Okay, finding some broader solutions. Liberalize drug laws. Why? Well, I'm sure somebody in the series has talked about homelessness and having a prison record. Well, a lot of these people who have a prison record were incarcerated because they violated the drug laws. A lot of these are needless drug. I mean, from my perspective, getting arrested for using a bit of cocaine or marijuana, from prison, you have to put that on your job application. You don't get the job, so it leads to joblessness. Joblessness leads to homelessness, right? So I think that's a big, broader, more fundamental solution. Also, obviously, greater tolerance of difference. Right? Racial and other kinds of discrimination still exists, and so we need to be better educated and more civilized in terms of how we treat people who are different from us. Finally, this liberalized immigration, you might think that, well, how does that going to help lower housing prices? This is really dealing with the opposite situation, where you have places like Detroit or St. Louis that have declining populations. And you have a lot of people coming in the United States, a lot from Latin America and Asia. And, the current administration wants to restrict even legal immigration. Well, there are places that are dying for immigrants. And so why not direct immigration to those cities that have a lot of vacancy and revive those economies? So, with a more lively economy, you can have, more and pleasant and cheaper housing. Okay, and to learn more, here are some places that you can look, and marketurbanism.org, marketurbanismreport.org, Strong Towns, City Journal, the book Zoned in the USA I mentioned before, and my essay with Emily Hamilton on how land use undermines affordable housing, that can be found at mercatus.org. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sandy. So we've got a bit of time left for questions here for those who want to stick around, and I have a few questions in the queue. So let me just ask one question myself about some of the solutions that you proposed towards the end of your talk. So a lot of it has to do with cutting back on or liberalizing existing land use regulation, which is something that I've heard from a number of other economists and people who've been observing the housing situation in California and elsewhere. And it makes a great deal of sense. My question for you is, how politically feasible do you think such reforms are? So people want their housing prices, current homeowners anyways, want their housing prices to continue to go up because they view it not just as a place to live, but also as an investment. And these artificial restrictions on the supply of new housing are part of what helps ensure that the price of their investment will go up. So how much of a political possibility do you think there is in overcoming that kind of NIMBYism restrictionist perspective and making real substantive changes in regulation?
Well, directly to that question, I guess your guess is as good as mine politically. But let me tell you certain things that I'm familiar with that have actually happened. And I mean, that in California, there are proposals that have come up, fairly regularly to allow high density construction around certain public venues like mass transit stations and things like that. And then that seems to be gaining some traction, and I think may have actually passed in California in some places. With respect to zoning, which has a lot to do with restricting the supply, as I've indicated, I'm kind of two minds there. One is to have the zoning regulations administered at either the state level or the national level. Let's say the state level, and so that would mean that would insulate the policy a little bit more from local stakeholders. Okay, the sort of the home voter phenomenon, who want to protect their investment, and so if the state of California, for example, were to say, well, no, we need to eliminate single-family zoning, which, as I said, actually took place in Minnesota, right? So this is happening someplace else. I can't remember off the top of my head, but this is happening, and it's happening because people, on the left and the right, have put kind of supply and demand together and realize, well, a lot of the problem is that restrictions on supply. So the other part of my mind is saying, well, maybe you should go the opposite direction. There's I'm sorry, I can't remember. I have a colleague in London, and his name slips my mind, but he made a very persuasive argument to me, saying that, well, maybe you should go completely the other direction. Allow neighborhoods to decide for themselves whether they want multifamily housing or not. because it's not always the case that a given neighborhood would object to it for the reasons you indicated, Laura. Sometimes having multifamily housing would enliven the street. Having mixed uses would make it a more desirable place to live. It could be a dead neighborhood. So let's get more diversity in our neighborhood, and there is that motivation, and so that may be one way to go. Of course, some neighborhoods would say, okay, we have the power, we're going to exclude everybody. The way things now are, they already have that ability to a large extent. But so I guess, so there are different approaches to it. And also it's actually, YIMBYism, so-called, is actually making progress along certain margins.
So one issue that comes up, which is related to this, in a lot of discussions over housing policy and housing problems, is the issue of gentrification. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about how that connects to some of the issues that you've been talking about. So is gentrification a product of the regulations that we've seen so far, or is it something we would have to worry about more if some of those regulations were stripped away?
As I said at the beginning of my talk, it's extremely complicated because there are opposing forces here. Part of the gentrification comes from the fact that you have rich people who can't find a place to live because there are certain restrictions on even luxury building. Now, often you hear the opposite complaint: they're only building luxury building. Well, that's not always the case. Right? Sometimes they'll say, no, we don't need another high-rise luxury apartment. So what's happening is kind of a downward demand. Right? You have people who are rich, who are trying to find bargains in lower income areas. So there's that. But of course, going the other way, there are in low income neighborhoods, which are thriving communities. You're in a living city. No neighborhood can sustain itself in the same way for very long. It's always going to be turnover. And in those neighborhoods that are relatively poor, have low income neighborhoods, where it's not a bad place to live. A lot of people who were born there want to move out, and so a lot of what we see as gentrification is space being opened up by the children who were born there, who want to move to other places, and those spaces being filled by newcomers to the city, or from what I've read, it's mostly people from other parts of the same city who want to move there. Something like, there's a statistic in my head, I don't have the citation, but on average, the number of people who move out over a period of time is about 10%. And so it's not a huge number. Now, 10% can mean a lot depending on who's moving out, but it's not like a huge turnover in a relatively short period of time, a decade or so. Over a longer period of time, of course, there'd be a tremendous turnover. Some neighborhoods decline, others neighborhoods grow. That's part of the inevitable part of the city, right? Just as some neighborhoods are gentrifying, other neighborhoods are declining, right? Those that are gentrifying did decline, right? That by definition, and they will build up, and they'll probably go down again, but there are better and worse ways. If you see that as a problem, there are better and worse ways to address that problem. One of the worst ways is to try to landmark the entire neighborhood and say, it has to stay exactly the way it is. No changes to the physical structure, because we want to preserve the, whatever it is, the atmosphere of it. And that will, over time, it'll have the appearance of, the old neighborhood, but it won't be the same. In a different context, Jane Jacobs called this taxidermy.
So allowing for this kind of dynamic process is something that you view as important to the regulatory regime. And I take it that's why you support something like housing vouchers as opposed to public housing, right? Where the vouchers are mobile, they're flexible. There's one of the people in the audience here, Marielle Crivet, asked about the idea of a universal basic income as a possible solution here. But I take it it's the same principle at work there at housing vouchers. If you want to provide people with something as flexible as possible to meet their needs rather than
Right, right. I mean, the worst way to do it is for the government to be a landlord. Right. That is the very worst. I think, our experience with public housing in the 20th century has um, uh, taught most people that that's a bad thing to do. But in the absence of alternatives, it's hard to get away from it. We still have a lot of public housing in New York and other places because we got it. But yeah, I think it's to give people a choice where to live. And as I mentioned, the problem with public housing is that it's hard to get out of it, right? You could, get a better job, but you'd lose your housing. That's a tough choice to make.
So Michael Mullen in the chat and somebody else expressed an interest in this issue too, wanted to hear more about what's going on with Hong Kong, right? So why do we have this outrageous 20-to-1 number with the median multiplier in Hong Kong?
Well, it's simply again, it's supply and demand, right? You have a growing population, or of wealthy people, but also strivers at the bottom who want to live. And I'm in my little study here in Brooklyn at 6 by 12, which I share with my wife. In Hong Kong, 6 people would live here, and so that it is bad. So yeah. Hong Kong is a peculiar situation, right? Because it is the buildable space is almost all used up, and you have on the supply side, and on the demand side, you have this increasing demand.
So is it more natural geographic factors at work in Hong Kong as opposed
yeah. I mean, it also works in Singapore. Singapore is different. It's a little bit bigger, but they've done it by basically this Singapore, which is a city state, owns something like 80% of the land, and so they lease it to people. Developers for like a 99-year lease, or if you want to build a home, it's a 99-year. So it's you don't own the land. You own the improved part of the land, but you don't own the land. It's kind of a Georgian approach, I guess. I don't know if it's consciously that, but the good thing about that is that even the Singapore government rents its space from itself. It has to pay a rent, and so if its opportunity costs are too high, if a business wants to move in, or if a hotel or an apartment building wants to use that space, they'll see that, oh, well, we can make more money, right? Since we own the land already, we'll stop using this space, we'll move out someplace where it's cheaper, okay, and then we'll rent the space out and we'll have everything. So, I mean, it's a kind of a Georgian socialized property solution in that city state. What is it, 5-6 million people? I don't think it's scalable, right? You try to scale it up, you get the Soviet Union, which I don't think is desirable for anybody. But there are. But the thing about Singapore, and I think to some extent Hong Kong, is that they do try to follow market signals as much as possible, and particularly in Singapore. From what I understand, the planners, the urban planners there are very sensitive to indicators of housing affordability and the mobility of the population. And they're constantly adjusting regulations to, at least for the middle class, to ensure affordability and mobility. Not so much if you're a foreign worker coming in, you're kind of out of luck in that situation.
So you mentioned Jane Jacobs a few times in your talk, which I was glad about. I'm a fan of her work, and always glad to have her introduced to any conversation where she's relevant. So maybe for those in the audience who don't know her work, what do you think is sort of the most important lesson to be gotten from Jacobs for thinking about these kinds of issues?
I think, if I were just to say it in a sentence or two, it would be that a city is a spontaneous order. That a city, for the most part, is an emergent, unplanned order, which doesn't mean that there's no planning by some sort of governmental authority or going on. But what makes the city great is what happens within the parameters of the planning. Land use, where you can build, what you can do with what you've built, um, is something that should be left up to individuals who are living there and using that space. Um, Again, she's certainly not like a radical free market person, but I think the underlying lesson that I've gotten from her is that a city is largely an unplanned, spontaneous order, and that would inform um, the rest of policy. Again, it's
Maybe
not
just say a little bit more about that, because that might
yeah,
be a phrase itself.
about the policy
About the
or
idea,
just
the
oh
significance of this idea of spontaneous order.
yeah. I mean, her complaint when she's written many books, but her most famous book is called "The Death and Life of Great American Cities." It was published in 1961. And this was sort of during the heyday of kind of heavy-handed top-down central planning at the local level, like people like Robert Moses or Ed Bacon in Philadelphia. Robert Moses in New York, Ed Bacon in Philadelphia, and big cities had their big planners. And what she pointed out was the way she didn't say that you should get rid of planning, but she said that they didn't understand when they made these plans that the life of the city occurs at street level, and especially in the public spaces of streets, sidewalk, plazas, and also in public spaces which are privately owned. That is, public spaces, as I define them, are places where you expect to encounter strangers on a regular basis, not your living room, but a coffee shop. Even a governmental owned unit is not necessarily a public space, like a police station or the CIA headquarters or something like that. So these are places where strangers interact. Okay, so what she explained was that a great city, and it's called Death and Life of Great American Cities, but many things can be applied to smaller cities as well. But in great cities, they have to be able to accommodate myriad strangers who are seeking opportunities, okay, one way or another. So understanding that, you first of all have to enable people to feel safe and secure amongst all these strangers in public space. And he said you can do that by police, okay, but if you do it by police, that's really a failure. The way cities have done it since the first cities is by having people eyes on the street. That's her term. Having ordinary people on the street in public spaces at all times of the day, just going from one destination to another. So you have to have multiple uses: offices, residential, commercial, entertainment, whatever it is, schools, churches, different attractors into a given area. So you have people on the street all the time, and that alone, right? Seeing a lot of other people alone will make you feel safer, other things equal. Other things equal, if you go into a street and it's deserted, even if it's broad daylight, you'll feel a little uncomfortable going down that street. And you feel uncomfortable, especially if it's a long street, okay, like warehouses on each side where there are any places to duck into. And so if the blocks are shorter, if there are more granularity in the uses, again, that contributes to safety. And that's what you call the bedrock attribute. You got to feel safe in public. From that, you get diversity of uses, get cultural and business uses. One thing I would say, I said spontaneous order is something that you should appreciate about Jane Jacobs. The other thing is that she regarded herself as an economist. Right? She said this explicitly. I had a chance to meet her and talk to her. But it's obvious from all her books. Almost all her books have to do with economics. Death and Life of Great American Cities is not in the title, but explicitly, she says, the core of that book is about economic development. Her second most popular book, or second book that came out in '69, was The Economy of Cities. And she wrote a book called The Nature of Economies. She wrote another book called Cities and the Wealth of Nations, echoing Jane Jacobs, right? So I asked her what she thought her main contribution to intellectual life was, and she said, right back, economic theory, and in particular, the theory of economic development. So that's what people don't appreciate about her. So the book I'm working on now, the subtitle of the book is Learning Economics on Social Theory from Jane Jacobs.
Well, that's fantastic. I hope a lot of people read that, and I hope they read.
I hope I finish it soon.
We've got one more question. We've got about time for one more question as well, so it works out. The last question that somebody asked was how racial inequalities in the U.S. factor into some of the issues that you've been discussing. And they asked that question fairly early on, and I think you said something about this, a few things about this throughout your talk. And one of the, just to see if I was getting it correctly, one of the ideas that seemed to come out of what you said was that, you know, a lot of these regulations, even kind of paradoxically, some of these regulations that seem intended to help sort of the vulnerable groups within society, wind up being manipulated in a way that have these disparate racial impacts and sort of exacerbating existing inequalities in society rather than correcting them. Is that a correct read on what you said, or?
Yeah, I mean, there are certain pernicious things like racial redlining that banks and other financial institutions practiced, you know, back in the day. There's exclusionary zoning, right? But you know, that's that apart, that aside, right? Things that are intended to help, you know, ought implies can. So if you want to help low-income households, then things like rent control exacerbate the problem in the way that I described. Chronic shortages of housing, and bidding for that limited housing that's available, which, you know, who's poor are not going to be able to afford these bribes and side payments. It's usually the relatively rich. In New York City, the Upper East Side has the highest concentration, which is the richest part of the city, has the highest concentration of rent-controlled apartments. Go figure. So that and then housing projects, which were, you know, which I mentioned were tried. This has a tendency to trap poor and most certainly minority, Black and Latino especially. That just makes it really difficult to get out of it. But it's you know, this is it's not all just housing policy. It's not all zoning, right? There are other policies, as we all know, that have these unintended consequences that reinforce what I've been talking about today does. And so if racial inequality is something that you're concerned about in terms of income and wealth, then you know, I'm a classical liberal. I think that the greatest key to income mobility and liberalization is liberalization of the economy, that allowing people mobility and freedom of choice as much as possible is the way to improve not only, you know, individualized, but also to reduce poverty as a whole. One other thing I should say is, as an economist, I'm less concerned, and this may get me in trouble, but I'm less concerned with income inequality than I am with poverty. I think the main problem is poverty. I say this to my students. I looked it up. Bill Gates is 60,000 times wealthier than me. Okay. Now, I don't consider myself rich, but you know, I'm comfortable enough. I don't feel oppressed by the fact that Bill Gates is 60,000 times wealthier than me. I would feel bad if somebody, you know, if I'm, let's say, you know, 20 times wealthier than somebody who's dirt poor and, you know, is living on $6 a day or something like that. That's something that needs to be addressed. So it's really an issue of poverty for me as opposed to inequality. But I know that people are concerned about inequality, you know, in dynamic economies, there will be equality, but equality with mobility, which is the classical liberal in me, right? Mobility to go up and down the different quintiles of income is the most important factor. Right? You're poor when you're young, you're relatively poor when you're old. In the middle, you're making all this income. So we have to consider that as well.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a terrific discussion. There's not a lot to be said in favor of pandemics and shutdowns in our Zoom economy, but the fact that we could bring you out here to speak to us without having to put you through the inconvenience of flying across the country and staying in a hotel.
I miss flying. I miss hotels.
Well,
to a point.
Maybe we'll fly you out here in person one day, but I was glad that we could get you out there for this. So thank you for your time, and thanks to all of you in the audience for coming out for this talk. Again, if you have friends who missed it, this will be on YouTube within a day or so. So see you all around, and enjoy the rest of your day.